Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to Virtual Intelligence Briefing, Best Practices for Purchasing Security Technology, Case Number 1, Cloud Offerings. I'm Victor Berlin, and I will be moderating this with two fabulous panelists, Mr. Eric Handy, Executive Vice President of KITSI, who's been an expert in the NIST Risk Management Framework and Cybersecurity Framework, and has been a third-party risk management engineer. Dr. Chris-Ann Herod, formerly Chief Security Officer of the Securities and Exchange Commission, now Senior Information Security Consultant. And they'll be sharing their perspectives on the best practices for purchasing cloud solutions to help you improve your security. So we're going to touch on a number of topics. We want to get you engaged. We'll have a number of polling questions at the end of the webinar. We'd like to get your input and tell us a little bit about where you are in the process. So when you're looking at purchasing a security technology, especially when you're focusing on a cloud solution, there are four basic questions. Number one, what should you be buying? How do you buy it? How much should you spend? And last but certainly not least, how do you assess the results of your purchasing process? And the challenge that we all face in making these decisions is balancing balancing the problem. When you're going after cloud offerings, you've got to worry about getting the best value. You have to focus on effectively managing the risks that you could incur or you're trying to prevent. You've got to stay within budget. And then you need to generate an acceptable ROI to satisfy the fiscal requirements of your organization, either your employer or your client. So Chris-Ann, in your experience, how successful have you seen enterprises in accomplishing this balancing act?
Well, thanks, Victor, and thank you for having me on the webinar today. Companies have been extremely successful in this space, and I think that there are a lot of reasons for that. I think that the cloud providers have, over the years, gotten extremely more mature in their offerings and in their flexibility and in their models that basically allow you to scale from a very small implementation up to a very large one. And I think all of those factors are very, very important. I also think that because there are three major players in this space, it becomes increasingly, I would say, increasingly more accessible for companies to look at the solutions. And those three providers, of course, are Google, AWS or Amazon Web Services, and then Microsoft's Azure. So I think people are getting smarter, and I think they understand that the risk of not going cloud can significantly hurt them. So I hope that answers that question, and on to you, Eric.
Yeah, Eric, what kind of recommendations would you make to individuals on how to do this balancing?
Well, good afternoon, good day to everybody. And again, thanks, Dr. Berlin, for having me on the webinar as well. As far as balancing this out, you know, when I look at this list here, the thing that seems to be the most challenging out of all these things, and as Chris-Ann mentioned, you know, there's three major players in the cloud environment. So as far as understanding cloud offerings and things of that nature is not a big pull for most people. For the most part, once you have the proper staffing available, getting the best value seems to be, you know, reasonable. Most people are handling that pretty well. Effectively managing risk is most people understand how to do risk assessments and manage risk at this point in time. And then, of course, there's always the budget issue that we all will deal with. But the thing I find is most difficult is generating an acceptable ROI. That seems to be the hardest thing for people to accomplish. It's actually to get an accurate measurement and metrics for that. So that's what I'm finding out there.
Great. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of some best practices on how to do that. Um, the decisions, though, as you're coming up with this purchasing decision, there are 5 different decisions that you need to think about: what to buy, then how much are you going to spend, who are you going to buy it from, how are you going to buy it, and last but certainly not least, how are you going to assess the results? Eric, how often have you seen the assessment step addressed first, following the mantra, define your endpoint first?
Well, a lot of times people like to skip right to the chase instead of creating the requirements and problem definition. They will try to go right to the endpoint and what is the problem they're trying to solve. But you risk at that point of missing the scope if you do that potentially, because you don't have your proper requirements in place ahead of time. So it's possible that you're missing some things you'll need at the end and perhaps could make a bad decision at that point. So I would say, yeah, the tendency is it's easy to go right to the chase and try to find a solution out the bat. But the proper way is probably to take a stand back, evaluate, get the proper definite, properly define the situation, I would say.
So thinking about assessment, I mean, Chris and Eric brought this up before, assessing the ROI, and certainly one of those results that you need to look at is the ROI. What recommendations do you have you made for clients on how to do that ROI assessment, how to get it set up and how to do it?
Right. Well, it's a cost versus benefit analysis that we propose that the clients go through. And first of all, of course, you build your business case. There's many strategic benefits to the cloud, including, as I mentioned before, the flexibility to scale as your business grows, the advantage of disaster recovery and business backup, business continuity. It is huge because that's really one of the key principles behind cloud and using cloud. And then for small businesses and large businesses, assess the types of security that you have to have and boil that down to, all right, so I'm doing this all in-house right now. My servers are in the basement of my building. And what's that costing me? Versus if I move to the cloud, I can be flexible. I can grow over time. I can mitigate my risk by moving everything into the cloud, including I get the benefit of disaster recovery and information security technology, at least basic. So all of that needs to be weighed together. And I think the advantages speak for themselves, and most clients come out on that positive end. It makes more sense to move to the cloud at this point.
Great. Well, let's start focusing on these specific questions. And the first question is what to buy. And one of the critical issues is problem definition. In other words, how will you know that what you bought has solved your problem? And what are some of the constraints that you have to work underneath? And these are issues that all of us have to face. So Chris Ann, how often do you see your clients thoroughly paying attention to problem definition?
Well, I think they already problem definition in the sense that they're looking at their current configurations, their current complexity, their current IT offerings, and they're saying, all right, I can reduce my cost, I can offload my risk. So from that perspective, they understand that it's not necessarily a problem, but it's a business proposition. And so cloud adoption rates, have tripled in 2020 and expanding in 2021. So they're seeing that landscape change. They've already decided that it's probably the right way to go. And I'm going to go back to what I said previously. It's now establishing the return on investment of moving to the cloud.
But what do you see as motivates people to make that decision to move to the cloud? What's the motive? What are some of the key motivators?
Well, I think cost is one, and outsourcing or mitigating your risk by moving to the cloud in terms of as I mentioned before, the data recovery backup, the security, availability, reliability of the systems. And as I said, cloud adoption speaks for itself in terms of the adoption rate. So it all boils down to that whole issue of ROI. And I think that's if you do your business case correctly, you will not have a problem convincing a C-suite that is the way to go.
So basically, one of your major recommendations is you've got to do that business case, and you've got to do a good job at it to be able to be persuasive, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so let's take a look at problem definition on how to define the problem. And in particular, who owns the problem and who is impacted by the problem. And paying attention to all these. So Eric, how thoroughly do you see your clients or employers paying attention to this, and what would you recommend to them to motivate them to really be thorough about their problem definition, making sure they involve all the stakeholders?
And I think Dr. Boling, you mentioned it specifically. You must have a diverse group of stakeholders when trying to make a decision on the cloud. You need a little bit of every discipline involved, from technical to business, system administrators, so you can properly define exactly what is needed, what models to choose from when it comes to the cloud, and so you can make the best move for your company. Also, when making technology solutions as well as for the cloud, how does that change your compliance landscape as well? In this case, going to the cloud, as Chrisanne mentioned, is in a lot of cases going to be a much safer way to go than if you decide to go on premise. So that's a huge advantage at that point, and it helps you when it comes to compliance, and it will change your compliance landscape and hopefully make it easier and less coverage from your standpoint.
So let's take a look at how to define the problem and who's involved. You've got the C-suite, you've got your employees, your customers, technical staff, administration. Chrisanne, have you seen any pattern on where the impetus for going to the cloud and getting a more secure technology comes from? Which of these stakeholders tends to be the leader in this, or does it vary?
I think it varies, definitely, but all of the roles, if you will, that you have up there on the slide are key to ensuring that you do have a very strong implementation. And so it boils down to there's multiple stakeholders, right? And the design and the implementation, as Eric said, is extremely important, because that's going to be based on your network, your architecture that you design. And I think one of the key components of any cloud implementation has got to be the cloud architect that you have. And it is a very specific role. Cloud architects are very well, what I want to say from a technical perspective, but they also from a business process and workflow analytics perspective. So you've got to have somebody that really understands how to implement a cloud solution. And that is just not, does one very key component that I think all organizations need to consider.
Well, but when you look at this, do you find the impetus is a reaction to a crisis? For example, you've mentioned that Pfizer, for example, has had a recent challenge, some serious challenges. Do you find improving your security technology in the cloud or going to the cloud is in reaction to a problem, or do you find your clients more anticipatory in looking at potential risks coming down the road? Eric, what's your perspective on that?
I think it's more reactionary to things that may be happening in the environment. I think a lot of people are looking, obviously, to go to the cloud for return on investment. It helps. For instance, it helps a smaller company compete with a bigger company in many cases by moving to the cloud. There's things that they can maximize because they're more efficient and smaller at that point with the cloud. So, but a lot of times it's going to be compliance related. It's going to be breach related. Something negative is going to happen that they're going to think, how can we have a better security solution. And one of those options will be moving to the cloud, from on-premise to the cloud. But I think Chris Ann mentioned, what she mentioned was very important, though. The solution architect is very key, and it's a hard resource to probably find, to someone that can do that well from a business side and also from a technical side, and understand both sides of it, and properly configure a great cloud solution for you.
Well, that brings us, you've touched on the next area, which is really great in terms of what is the problem. And one of the key points that you made, which relates to becoming more competitive, which allows a smaller business to compete with a larger business. So going to the cloud levels the playing field. Is that something you've seen occur, Chris Ann?
Yeah, absolutely. Companies both large and small are moving to the cloud because it does provide a robust environment that scales, as I said before. And it also provides those other types of solutions that you may not be able to acquire as cost effectively as you would if you just bundle everything and move it to the cloud. And I'm not saying, your entire infrastructure has to go that way, but for the most part, if you've got key applications that you want to protect, and you want to move those from your on-premise to a cloud solution, then by all means, that adds not only to your competitiveness, but it also adds, as Eric said, it eliminates a lot of issues around compliance, it offloads your risk, and it substantially reduces your cost.
So in a sense, when you think about the ROI, part of that return is becoming more competitive.
Absolutely.
And so when a business looks at what kinds of customers they're capturing and how they're capturing, how they're able to service them, they can go after customers that they would not typically go after because they had larger competitors, and now they've leveled the playing field. So that would be a key ingredient in that ROI assessment, correct?
Yes, absolutely. I think moving to the cloud gives you basically access to what I would call enterprise class technology for everyone. So to Eric's point, smaller businesses can act faster and be entirely more competitive than in large establishments. And so the pay-as-you-go model, as I said before, it really does level the playing field, because as small businesses can acquire this technology, they can also grow with it.
So that brings us to the next focus, which is, again, focusing back on the roles about who owns the problem. The C-suite owns the problem when it comes to becoming more competitive. I mean, they want to be sure they're positioning the enterprise to capture as much of the market as they can. So they own that part of the problem. And these other roles, the technology team, as you mentioned, the cloud architect is critical in making that transition. The customers, getting more customers, getting a more penetrating the market more, that shows that you are becoming more competitive. So getting all these stakeholders involved in the process ensures that you are coming up with a solution that will position the enterprise to be more successful. Eric, how much have you seen enterprises explicitly think about using the cloud to become more competitive?
Quite a bit. Quite a bit when you move to the cloud. Again, everything that Chris Ann has mentioned, as far as the efficiencies that you get, how the smaller company can now compete with the bigger company. And as I look through this list here, who owns the problem? And, obviously everyone's involved here. And one thing that stands out for me is the customers. When you move to a different landscape, different environment, in this case, if you move from the cloud, from on-premise to the cloud, when it comes to customers, maybe at this point you can give your customers something you haven't been able to give them before because of the move to the cloud, such as better auditing functions and better log tracking and things of that nature that you weren't able to offer before. So there's some advantages as far as giving something back to the customer that you may not have been able to do in the old environment. So this is one thing that struck out to me out of this list here, and who owns the problem. But everyone seems to be owning the problem for the most part.
Got it. So let's take a look at who's impacted by the problem. And again, you're trying to improve the ROI. So that means you're going to make it easier for the staff to do work. You're going to make it easier for customers to purchase products, pay for products, get help, access the products. You're going to make it easier for technology teams to deal with challenges they're facing. And you're going to make it easier for the C-suite to meet compliance challenges as well as improve the ROI of the firm. Is this the type of analysis you see happening when organizations consider moving to the cloud? Have you seen this, Chris-Ann?
Absolutely. The motivation is usually tied to a number of different factors, many of which we've already touched on. But I think one of the most important things is that moving to the cloud, as Eric said, does provide your customers with potentially more services. It also provides you the company implementing the cloud solution. It also provides you with that competitive advantage, as we said, and it provides you with a way to promote I would say your capabilities, because once you're in a cloud environment and you're operating securely, and I think we haven't touched on the secure part of this yet, but there's so many things that we're doing in the cloud space that add a level of security to what you're doing, and so that automatically helps you promote your application or whatever it might be that you're hosting in the cloud to actually better serve your customer base.
Right. And so let's take a look at, we'll start to take a look at the security problem immediately, since you brought it up. And clearly, the issues that have to be raised are, what do you need to protect, and what do you need to be protected from, and how much protection do you need? And then your loss analysis. What's the expected loss if you don't obtain the protection? And obviously, how much protection can you afford? So how explicitly, Eric, have you seen your clients go through this kind of analysis?
I see everyone's pretty much going through the analysis. That's not really an issue that I see. I think people are looking at what the loss, what's going to cost us, what's the benefit and cost ratio and those sort of things. What I do wonder sometimes is how accurate is some measurements, such as how much protection can you afford? If you do get a breach, if something does go wrong, how much is it really going to cost you versus putting in the proper security controls in the first place? Sometimes it seems like we underestimate what that value is. And then once we get breached, it's triple the amount that we anticipated. And it looks like a great deal now to put the proper controls in place all of a sudden. So that's what I really see happening out there more than anything.
Well, when you take a look at the cloud arena, you've got to have your systems protected and your cloud information/data protected. What methods have you recommended, given your background, Eric, in terms of the tools to do this assessment and make sure you're identifying what needs to be protected and putting in place the protection?
Well, I guess when it comes to the tools and what you need when you move to the cloud, a lot of times what you want to do is, depending on what model you choose, whether it's infrastructure, platform, or software as a service, and there's different other models that come out as we go through time. What controls do you really need to worry about the most? Where you're most vulnerable, and that would be in the I would say the access control area. So what kind of access control solutions you need to go along with this product, or go along with the solution. Identification and authentication areas. What are you going to plan to use in that area? Auditing. How are you going to audit things? How are you going to audit on your side versus the cloud side? So these are kind of the controls. There's various controls you want to focus on, and those are just three ones that come top of my mind. And this is why you need the the solution architect, the architect that Chris Hanna mentioned earlier. And that's why it's so important that that person is very good at what they do, so they can lead you the right direction to pick the right solutions.
Great. Well, Chris-Ann, as we're focusing on this, how important is using a tool like the NIST Risk Management Framework or the FedRAMP methodology for identifying what needs to be protected and coming up with remediation plans?
Well, I think they're extremely helpful and very important in terms of providing standards of controls, and organizations should be aware of them, and that they're cost-free tools that the NIST provides, the US government provides. There's also a great deal of information that's available around the benefits of the cloud and protecting your business from threats, guarding against internal threats, which the cloud does help you do, and then preventing data loss, which is very key. So all of those controls are wrapped into that. As Eric mentioned, access control, threat prevention, threat detection, threat mitigation and redundancy, your compliance, and your security policies. So the NIST framework, for example, and specifically the NIST framework that was designed for cloud implementations, will address all of those things and help you walk through your controls that are in place now and identify your gaps. So Victor, I think they're very, very important.
Well, that brings us right to the next item, which is what do they need to be protected from? Now, clearly, we put audits in here because if you get audited and you're not in compliant, that's a problem. You've got threats, you've got internal threats and external threats. You can have a malfunction, all of the above. Do you see these factors being incorporated and driving the assessment of the cloud solutions and the way they deal with the cloud provider, Chris-Ann?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the security piece of cloud offerings has become extremely important over time, given the types of threats that are so prevalent. And when you're talking about malware and ransomware, these pose the greatest threats to organizations right now. And so, the statistics are mind-boggling in terms of how many attacks per day, per hour are occurring on small and large businesses alike. So yes, it's very important to identify and treat these things from a cloud-based perspective. And so I think that the cloud security set of controls that have been developed and been validated by FedRAMP, for example, so that's the big three, right? So Google, Microsoft, and Amazon have all gone through the FedRAMP certification, and any cloud provider that's going to do business with you or you're going to do business with them needs to be at least FedRAMP certified or at least gone through and can provide you with a SOC 1 or SOC 2 report based on an evaluation or an audit of their security capabilities.
Well, that brings us to the next question: is how much protection do you need? And worst case analysis. What if you lost X? And what if you lost access to your cloud system? What if your cloud data is lost or corrupted? Do you find, Eric, that your clients and organizations you've worked with take all of this into account and do this what if analysis as they're doing the requirements analysis?
Well, Dr. Berlin, I think they do an analysis, but again, it comes to how accurate is that analysis going to be? Do you consider all the factors possibly that are out there? Now, going to a cloud system kind of makes it a little bit easier to manage the risk at that point because you have a lot of protections in place. You have a lot of compliance checks that you're going to make by nature, but there is also the handoff process between the cloud and your company as well. That is a risk area that we'll talk about probably later, but there is a handoff that has to happen. And so that needs to be seriously considered as well when it comes to protection and loss and those type of things like that. But my question is, how accurate are we able to predict the losses? Again, it seems like we underestimate the loss situation, especially when you're considering adding controls and the prices of the controls, what that's going to be. And so you don't really focus so much on how much is really going to cost you if there is a breach because you don't have that control. So until after it happens, then you realize, oh, wow, it was much more expansive than we thought.
So Chrisanne, do you have any recommendations on how to do this cost estimation of what the cost of a loss is? Or what you've seen others doing successfully?
Well, I think that, as Eric pointed out, the cost of the loss is based on what was lost, and what your reputational damage is going to be. And I think we mentioned this Pfizer breach, but it happened 6 days ago, and you're talking about confidential medical information, including full names, addresses, email addresses. All of that was basically exposed because of a weak cloud implementation. So all I can tell you from that perspective is there are many use cases out there of major companies that have experienced this data loss, and the cost is enormous, especially in terms of reputational damage. I mean, just think Target or think Pfizer. And I think that basically paints the picture. So yes, companies are very aware that the loss of information can result in fines, especially if you're a healthcare organization. So it benefits everyone to make sure you understand the pros and cons of moving to the cloud, but then that you verify the security of that cloud implementation. And there's some, at least, I would say, peace of mind in knowing that they followed good security practices, and you're also following good security practices as a result of that.
Do you see them using any systematic process for doing this calculation in advance of a loss? In other words, where they're actually thinking through what is the cost impact, or what is the loss impact of a particular breach, or
well, I think that's where risk assessment comes into play, right? So most companies have some risk assessment methodology in place where they look at the corporate environment from a risk perspective. And yes, it can be calculated. That's a good practice to have a risk assessment methodology and conduct frequent risk assessments, not only from an IT perspective, but from a broader perspective. And corporations have multiple levels of risk, right? So I know we're focused here on IT, but many organizations do perform risk assessments and do calculate the loss based on their models. And so it just really depends on how much information they have and what the classification of that information is.
Great. So let's take a look at how much they can afford and how they make that budgeting decision. So we segue into that process, Chrisanne. How do they decide how much to spend? What have you seen their process, and who does it, how they get involved, and what they focus on?
Well, we've touched on a couple of these issues, and I think I'll just kind of wrap it up by saying, first of all, you've got to have a professional cloud architect and a solutions based committee, if you will, to design and plan your cloud solution. That way you can basically adjudicate how much your available budget's going to be and how much of a reallocation of resources needs to go to that. But I think you've got to understand and convert your technical requirements into that architecture design. You've got to develop your policies and procedures, and you've got to test to that. So you've got to model everything before you actually implement. And I think once you've done that, that meets a good balance of, yes, it's going to cost me less. Yes, it's going to reduce my resources. And that's usually the outcome of a cloud solution.
Great. Well, let's take a look at the constraints then that they've got to work within: the financial, the staffing, their market, security constraints. So Eric, do you see this systematically as you identify the stakeholders in this decision process? How do you see them integrating these different constraints in that decision process? Or don't you?
No, I see, Dr. Brennan, I definitely see them integrating to a large level. For instance, financially, which is more budgets, and that's always going to be an issue of not having enough finances to quite support the solution that you may want. Staffing also, constraint comes into play because it's hard to find some of the cloud architects and the things and resources that you'll need, which can again relate to the financial budget issue when it comes to staffing. And it's hard to find those people, and you need the staffing. And then the staffing has to be trained to a certain level to be even to handle certain technology. And if the staff is not up to a certain level, then you can't choose certain solutions in that case unless you train them up properly. So those things have to be considered as well in the dynamics. The customer market, which you could be restricted in that area, and from a security standpoint, it's also related to all these other constraints as well, because you're limited from a security standpoint on your current environment, on what you can protect and what you can't protect, which is a good reason to move to the cloud, because maybe you can all of a sudden have some additional capabilities, as Chris had mentioned a while back.
Well, you mentioned shared responsibilities, a critical element, and that the client and the cloud provider have to share responsibilities, understand that handoff process.
Yes.
And what are some of the challenges that you would have to face in that scenario, and how would you handle them?
Well, as you move to the cloud, you're basically renting out a virtual data center at that point in time, and so you're paying for the space. But what you do within that space, whether it's Google, Microsoft, or AWS, what you do within that space, in some cases, depending on your model, is up to you and is in your jurisdiction. So such things as access control, giving out rights, you will control to a certain degree, but there will be a handoff between you and the cloud provider, AWS, Google, Microsoft, whoever, Azure. There'll be a handoff, for instance, with the access rights, where you'll take over. And so you must have someone there who understands where that handoff takes place. So when it's your responsibility versus their responsibility. And there is a shared responsibility matrix that you will find that most of the cloud providers they'll help you through this. So that's the biggest problem, well, not the biggest problem, but the biggest issue or concern you will have is, when do we take over versus what are they responsible for and what are we responsible for? So that has to be established early between the agreements when you decide to bring on a CSP.
Got it. So when you start to drill down on these financial constraints, have you seen resource reallocations occur as these decisions are being made? Have you seen explicit decisions made that, well, we've got to reallocate our resources to get enhanced security in the cloud? Is that something that you've observed, Chris-Ann?
Well, it's a reallocation of resources, and to some extent, it's also an outsourcing of sorts, because as we talked about, the cloud architect, cloud solution providers, they're very unique and in terms of their skill sets. And while the cloud costs are flexible, and by outsourcing to the cloud, it does save you money and it's less costly, and that's been shown over and over again in different surveys. The retention issue for individuals that have expertise in either cloud implementation, cloud architecture, or security cloud engineering, it's a very competitive skill set, and so it's tough to find people. And I think that is the biggest issue. It's not necessarily that you have to resource allocate, but in terms of money, but it's the people part of this that really is very expensive, and that's where you have to make a decision as to whether you want to hire internally, or whether you want to outsource your architecture to a third party. So there are financial constraints, and it does go back to budget. And you should be very concerned about your resources, whether it's a person resource or a dollar resource. And that question at the end, what can you afford to lose? We talked about that. So it's very impactful, and I think that all has to be taken into consideration when you do your risk assessment.
So that brings us right to the next issue you've raised, which is staffing constraints. And basically you need the right person to share that responsibility, to do the handoff that Eric just mentioned. And what you posed, Chrisanne, is that there's a choice. You know, do you build up your internal staff or do you outsource it? What trends are you observing given the shortage of staff?
I'm observing the outsourced part of this. I mean, I just talked to a client yesterday who has had a job requisition out for a cloud security engineer for over a year. And because they can't either meet their salary requirements or, you know, whatever it might be, they're not able to fill that position, whether it's a skill set issue or it's a salary issue. And so that's the biggest challenge. So outsourcing seems to be the trend because it's very difficult once an organization hires someone with these skills and is able to pay them. Invariably, they get snagged or snapped up by another organization who's willing to pay them more. So it truly is a problem. It's a resource problem, a skill set problem. And I think it was Indeed.com just did a recent survey around this very issue. And in 2021 and beyond, they're predicting that this whole cloud services domain and the requirement for cloud services skill sets is going to triple in the next 2 to 3 years. So, you know, if you're looking for a good job opportunity, now's the time to, you know, sharpen your skill sets in cloud because it's really a problem.
Well, that brings us right into the customer market constraints. And that is, we've talked about, as you've just pointed out, Chrisanne, having the staff capability to utilize the cloud solution. But what are the customer constraints, Eric, that you've seen and willingness to utilize the cloud offerings that you provide to your customers and willingness to comply with that? I mean, you see that in e-commerce, you see that everywhere. What have you seen as the constraints that your clients have had to work with?
Well, from the customer side, you know, sometimes you're limited by their environment and their budget and different things of that nature. So even though you may be able to dream up the perfect solution, you're kind of restricted by what resources they have to offer you to get the job done. So you'll find that sometimes that you could be constrained on the solution that you can offer. You may have to, instead of offering solution A, the supreme solution, you might have to offer a more general solution instead to fit their budget or to fit their constraint versus you know, their technical staff and where they're at versus to pull this off. So those decisions you have to make for them and give them the best solution.
Got it. Well, that brings us to something we've been talking about, which is the security constraints that you need to deal with, the shared responsibility and the compliance requirements. And all of these things come together in order to make the decision. When you deal with these constraints, you deal with these requirements, it brings us to the next question, which is what solution to buy? What is it that you buy? You start with your requirements. You've got to figure out how to buy it, from whom to buy it, how much to budget, and then how are you going to assess it? Not only how are you going to assess it before you buy it, but how are you going to assess it after you buy it? And to what extent, Eric, in terms of purchasing the solution, how long is this, first of all, how long does this typically take for an organization that you've seen, once from the point of view they decide we've got to solve this problem to the point where they've implemented a solution?
It all depends, but something as complex as moving to the cloud could take, you know, quite some time, anywhere from 6 months to a year, all depending. And that's, you know, that's meeting with various vendors, hearing sales pitches based on availability. So there's a lot of things that will go into that. But 6 months to a year, I would say, to do a real comprehensive solution evaluation and how to assess it. And that's bringing people in, doing demos, doing your own demo where you get to kick the tires a little bit to make sure this is the right solution that it addresses all of your wants and requirements. So to do it properly, it's going to take some time. It can be a major project in that case.
So as you're planning to get the benefits of a cloud solution, you have to put into your forecast that the ROI is not going to start appearing for another 6 to 9 months, 6 to 12 months, and then it's just going to be starting. So you're making an investment of your time in figuring this out before you actually get the return on investment.
Right.
And that has to be calculated into that process. So the question then is, okay, how do you select the solution? And what is the process for selecting the solution? Chris-Ann, is this something where you find most of the clients you deal with have a systematic process for doing this?
Well, for selecting a solution, I think that most of the clients that I've dealt with have already explored their solutions in advance. And again, I go back to most organizations are migrating towards one of the big three, either Amazon, Google, or Microsoft. And so the solution selection is going to be based on their implementation, their specific design requirements, and what they want to achieve. Because pricing, quite honestly, again, it's scalable, it's flexible, so the cost is relatively the same. I think just all depends on the service level agreements that you have in place or you can put in place. As Eric said, talking with each one of the solution providers and making sure that they have the proper certifications in place that they can meet your security requirements, your disaster recovery requirements, and that they have specific proof of their operating procedures, and they've been validated either through a SOC 1 or a SOC 2 report or some type of an audit, independent audit that can substantiate their claims. And as Eric also pointed out, there's a shared responsibility matrix that has to be agreed upon between you and the solution provider. So all of those things are important. And I think that most of my clients have already taken that into consideration.
And do you see this vary, whether it's a small, medium, or large size business?
The only thing that I see relative to the size is the amount of applications that are being transferred over to a secure cloud environment. Many organizations, in fact, I have one client that only has one application in the cloud, but it's a very important application for their business. So it could be one or it could be 30 applications, and that's going to drive the cost, of course, and that's going to drive a whole lot of other factors, including how you architect your solution.
So when you talk about the actual purchase process, once they've decided, what the solution is, how to buy is basically what you're saying is selecting among those three vendors or some others. And do you see any patterns about what the criteria are that make them pick one vendor versus another? Eric?
Well, when it comes to buying and selecting a vendor and selecting one over the other, one thing that Chris-Ann just brought up is sort of the third-party risk management side of things, where you need to kick the tires and make sure that they're doing everything that they need to do from a security standpoint. And luckily, because there's three main players right now, there is a lot of information out there on between Google, AWS, and Azure, Microsoft. There's a lot of information out there already that can help you make that decision. And you can easily see that they're FedRAMP approved, PCI certified, SOC 2 certified. So you can gain all the information most of the time from their trust. They most have a trust center website that lists all of this information that you can gain access to. So that's one way of doing that. So before you buy anything, make sure that it's not going to cause a compliance problem for you.
Well, that brings us to the next. When you decide who to buy from, how involved do people get in actually testing the solution and putting it through a test, Chris-Ann?
That's an interesting question, because as far as testing the solution, I mean, most of the time, what I see my clients doing is testing after the fact. In other words, you'll adopt the technology, you'll adopt the solution, you'll move an application in, and then you'll do some testing to make sure that your access controls, your firewalls, your data masking, whatever that might be, and your data securities, your VPNs are working, and that sort of thing. So I don't see a whole lot of pre-testing going on. I see a whole lot of, after the fact, let's kick, as Eric said, kick the tires and see if we can make, if it works the way we're supposed to, as advertised, essentially.
So, but would you recommend they do? Do you like that approach? Do you recommend that approach, or do you think pre-testing would be beneficial?
I'm not so sure, actually, because I think that the solution itself has been vetted in so many ways, and so many considerations have already been basically vetted in terms of the providers. They've all gone through FedRAMP. Most of them, in fact, even the smaller providers have been certified. So as far as what you're testing is you're testing your controls and how they basically, the handoff, as Eric was saying, to the cloud provider. It's hard to test that without actually putting an application in place.
Right. So, but the contracts are written in a way, if things don't work out, they can exit.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's important part of the purchasing process, in terms of protecting yourself if you're not getting the performance you required. So, and now you've just answered this question, which is how to assess the security technology you've purchased and making sure that it works. Is you're essentially saying, put out the application, make sure it works, make sure the metrics are conformed with, and then you essentially determine if your problem has been solved. Now, you're not going to immediately know if your competitive position has improved, but you're going to know whether the features enable you to accomplish that. Is there anything you would add to this assessment element, Eric?
No, I wouldn't add anything for the most part. As Chrisanne said, it's a pretty much vetted situation when it comes to the cloud CSPs, the cloud suppliers, supply providers. It's pretty much a vetted situation. So there's not that much of a need for an assessment plan. But whenever you're doing another tool, or if you were, say, doing a access control tool, maybe there is a scenario that you can run through to make sure that you can give the rights and controls that you need to give, and maybe run through a couple of test cases from that standpoint. Would be nice. Therefore, you know what you're getting is going to solve your problem. It's going to hit all your requirements.
Great. Okay. Well, that's been very helpful. What we want to do now is launch 5 poll questions. We'd like our audience to give us some feedback and also tell us a little bit about where they stand. Okay, we've got a nice return. Take a look at the results. So interesting. We have 32% are currently involved in a purchasing process at this time. And 22% anticipate getting involved in the future. We've got 35% have been involved in developing requirements. So it's been a wide distribution of the roles that have been played. A very experienced audience in a wide variety of the area. We see, though, a number would like to see some improvements with either among their clients or their employers. And they give you some ideas of how to do that. And then in terms of their next, we've got about, over more than half who are anticipating within a year or less, they're going to be making another purchase. So fantastic. So we're now going to have some Q&A. We've got some questions that we're going to answer. We got a question from Ruth. What kind of staff is needed to implement this type of cloud technology purchasing process? Ruth, that's a great question. Actually, all of the stakeholders who are impacted by the security technology and the cloud solution need to be involved or represented. I think, Eric, you made that point that all the stakeholders have to be involved if it's going to be successful, correct?
Yes, yes. You need a wide, diverse group to make sure you're covering all your bases and got the proper scope.
So, right. And Jeannie asked, what if you do not have the budget required to purchase enhanced security options you need for your cloud system? Jeannie, that's a very important question. Again, this comes back to your business objectives and the risk it faces. Think of it as insurance. Your insurance will have, your organization will have to make trade-offs as it reviews its objectives to determine if it can afford the risk exposure of not managing the cloud system risks. Going into the cloud requires an investment in both the applications and security of the application. The launch of a cloud application must include the resources for both, and you have to be very careful about it. I think, Chris-Ann, though, you made the point that going into the cloud actually saves money. So those dollars that are being spent could be used to get those enhancements. Is that correct?
Well, yes, Victor, that is correct. And there's been a lot of use cases developed around this, and costs have been shown to actually drop because you're not using, your own internal resources anymore to manage certain aspects of your IT infrastructure. So yeah, definitely.
So Alice asked, is purchasing your cloud offering better done with a consultant or with building an in-house team? You chuckled, Chris-Ann.
Well, only because we talked about this early on, and I think that there's, because of this skill set shortage and the expense of hiring a full-time employee versus a consultant that can come in and do the work, and then basically help you implement. The cost has to be weighed from both sides of the equation, and whether or not you as a business can afford one or the other solution. But again, from what I've seen, most of this has been outsourced to consulting firms that are specializing in cloud implementation, or to the cloud provider itself, because they offer cloud implementation services as well.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, it looks like we've run out of time. We've had some great responses, and we will be getting back to everybody. So if you have any further questions, we've got, you'll see our email address in the deck that you get, where you can certainly submit your emails to virtual intelligence briefing, and we can get responses to you. So I wish you the best of luck. Thank you very much for attending, and Eric, Chris-Ann, thank you for your participation. Really appreciate it. Have a great afternoon.
Thank
Okay,
you.
everyone. Thank you.